Another happy day today. So glad to have Professor Patrick Sériot with us from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland. He's probably the best specialist in the world about the history of structuralism in the 20th century, and history of ideas in general linguistics and semiotics, and particularly on this East European regions. But as usual, just some books for the beginning. Some new, some not so new. First, what I recently found is a pretty interesting title, Structuralisms Today, with subtitle Paris, Prague, Tartu, which fits with our today's topic pretty well. And then two very recent books of our roots in a way. That's Carlo Brentani's monograph about Jakobson in Italian. Then Oxford Handbook of Culture and Psychology, edited by Jan Balsiner, a huge volume which includes also some chapters from our university. And then from Lausanne, they are publishing a journal. They're here, one volume from last year, mostly in French, but not only.
Mostly, but not all.
Yeah. And then Patrick Sériot's monograph, Structuralism. This has been published already in several languages. Here is the second French edition and Russian edition. English translation is in preparation and will be published in the series of semiotics, communication and cognition, the Greater Mouton. And here, a bilingual edition of Jakubinsky, translated by Patrick Sériot and Irina Ivanova. And now Patrick Sériot will give us 3 lectures this week. The first is, each of them is about our roots in a way, but this one, interestingly, connects one of major forerunners for us in semiotics, Roman Jakobson, and then Lev Berg, who actually was one of initiators for our local movement in theoretical biology from already late 70s. And now it happens that these have additional connections.
Okay, thank you. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm quite happy to be here. It's not the first time I'm here. We'll have 3 lectures together. Today I shall speak about the relationships between biology and linguistics in the beginning of the 20th century in the Russian culture. Tomorrow we'll speak about the theory of knowledge, and the day after tomorrow we'll speak about the sort of history of the relationship to sign in Russian culture. First of all, a couple of words about what I'm doing. I'm not a semiotician, I'm a linguist, specialized, as Kalevi Kull told about, in the history of ideas in human sciences, in a comparative perspective between Eastern and Western Europe. Of course, nobody knows where the border between East and West passes, and this is precisely what is so interesting, that there is no border. English is not my native language, but I hope I'll make it understandable. So in Lausanne, we have a great freedom to do exactly what we want, which is something quite fantastic in universities now. And with my group of PhD students, we try to study the specificity of the discourse on language in Eastern Europe in a comparative epistemological perspective with so-called Western Europe. So why are we going to speak about Jakobson, linguistics and biology today? Because I think that there is a huge amount of knowledge which lacks in the whole history of structuralism and ideas in human sciences in general. So I'll begin. And please, if something is not clear, do interrupt me. So, we shall speak of Jakobson, whom everybody knows, and of Lev Berg, whom very few people know, unfortunately. So, you see, the more one notion or concept is used, and in general, the less it is understood. As for instance, structuralism. May I ask any one of you to give a definition of structuralism? What is structuralism for you?
It is an approach that studies some cultural phenomena from the point of view of relations between the elements. And relations, through the relations, we may define the elements of the.
That's right. That's right. So you insist on the fact that the relationship between elements is more important than the elements inside the relationship. That I totally agree with you. So I'll try to show that for Jakobson, it was not at all what you and I have defined as structuralism. That's the point of today. This is our deeply respected, deeply beloved Roman Jakobson. This is old Jakobson, who is known as, quote, an American scholar. As if Jakobson had all his life lived in an Anglo-Saxon speaking world. But you see, Jakobson, before being old, has been young. So this is another Jakobson, who is less well known. This is Jakobson when he was in 1916 in the University of Moscow. I must say that it is a miracle that Jakobson has been able to be first in Moscow and second in the University of Moscow, because as a Jew in the Russian Empire, he had no right in principle not only to live in the town of Moscow or St. Petersburg, but even to go to the university. But his parents were rich enough to have the very specific permission to live in the capital, and even for him to go to the university. So this is not this Jakobson that we shall speak about, but Jakobson in Czechoslovakia. This is Jakobson in 1927 in Prague, and first of all, Jakobson in Brno in the 1930s. Well, you see, Jakobson was someone extremely original. All my Russian friends who have known him were absolutely enthusiastic about his capacity of drinking vodka and keeping with a clear head. And Jakobson had a very specific and great sense of humor. For instance, once a journalist asked him, Mr. Jakobson, tell us, how many wives did you have in your life? And he answered, you mean in diachrony or in synchrony? So that's exactly the kind of linguist. If all the linguists were the same, you know, our job will be quite more interesting. So, I shall begin with something extremely puzzling. You see, in the 1930s, Jakobson rather regularly repeated a quote from Joseph de Maistre, in French, ne parlons jamais de hasard ni de signes arbitraires. Never speak of chance and arbitrary signs. Which is quite puzzling if you stick to Ferdinand de Saussure's definition of what a structure is. Now, never speak of chance and arbitrary signs is puzzling because do you know who Joseph de Maistre was? Does that name mean anything for you? Okay, he was one of the most reactionary, anti-revolutionary philosophers. Just as Edmund Burke in Great Britain, he was totally opposed to the values of the French Revolution and of the Enlightenment in general. So how come that our once again deeply respected and beloved Jakobson quoted Joseph de Maistre so often, not only in the 1930s, but also at the end of his life in his dialogues with Krystyna Pomorska in 1980. So this is the first mystery I would like to solve with you today. So, one more detail. What exactly is at stake here? And look, I'm going to tell you the creation of the world. In the beginning, there was nothing. You see, there was nothing. This is for you. And God created the ocean, right? And then God created the land, and a very peculiar place in the earth. So he created this land, he created also the rivers, he created mountains, but I don't know how to draw mountains on the computer, so you won't have the mountains, but never mind. Then he created, for best of our worst, men, and men created towns. And you see, here we have Russia, and here we have more or less Western Europe. Once again, nobody knows where the border, but never mind. And what is striking is that between Western Europe and Russia, there is something which is quite less well known. If you draw a line between the Baltic and the Black Sea, between the Baltic and the Adriatic, and between the Adriatic and the Baltic and the Black Sea, you get a sort of terra incognita. And this terra incognita, this not only geographical but symbolic border between two intellectual universes is interesting. It is something which is not obvious at all. So this is what we are interested in. I could include the Baltic state, of course. So there is some other mystery. Is Estonia in the east or in the west, for instance? I think this question has no answer at all because it is badly asked. But nonetheless, this is typically the kind of questions that Jakobson asked. So where is the symbolic border? Well, okay. To answer this question, there are two possibilities, either through nature or through culture. I am on this side, and Jakobson was on this side. First, a couple of indications. You probably don't know him. This is Hilferdings. Hilferding thought in 1853 that there are two different worlds, and that Russia is in the east, but in Eastern Europe. He was, as many scholars in the 18th century, 19th century, he was a philosopher, a poet, a linguist, an historian, etc. So I just give you an example of how he saw this symbolic border between Russia and what is not Russia. You see, for him, there are two parts, the West and the East. And there are two continents, Europe and Asia. He speaks of languages. For him, Latin, Greek, Celtic, etc. are spoken in Western Europe. And what is really interesting is that Iranian is spoke in Asia, but it is the Western world. Now, Sanskrit, no problem, it is in Eastern Asia, but what is really striking is that Slavic and Lithuanian are in Europe, but in the East. You see, I insist on the fact that Iranian is in Asia, but in the West, whereas Lithuanian and Slavic are in Europe, but in the East. So it means that the symbolic border between West and East is more important, is more symbolically important than the border between Europe and Asia. Okay, this is the first step. Now, the second one will be Lemansky. For Lemansky, there are no two worlds, but three worlds. And Russia is neither in Europe nor in Asia. It is in the middle world. 1892, три мира изиска европейского материка. So what is the situation for him? For him, there are worlds. You see, if you take the whole continental mass between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, you get something which he calls Eurasia. But Eurasia, this huge mass of land, is divided into three worlds: Europe proper, Middle World, and Asia proper. So we can draw lines of dividing between all those worlds. And Europe proper is the so-called Romano-Germanic world, which is Catholic and Protestant. The middle world is Orthodox. It means a Greco-Slavic world. And finally, we have a totally negative definition of what is neither Orthodox nor Catholic or Protestant, which means the Asiatic world. So I want to draw your attention to this line, which is the most important between us and them. Now, a problem begins here with those Slavs. The Slavs have a problem as far as this dividing exists, you see, because there are Slavs who are Catholic. What shall we do with the Slavs who are Catholic? Do they belong to the Middle World or to Europe proper? For Lemansky, it was not clear, but something what was important is that Russians were in the Greco-Slavic world because they are Orthodox. Now, you see those Poles and Slovaks and Czechs do make a problem here. Now, what is the situation with the languages? If there are three worlds, there necessarily are three groups of languages which correspond to those worlds. The Western Aryan languages, Latin, German, and Celtic, Greek, Slavic, and Lithuanian, and finally, everything which is neither Greek, Slavic, or Lithuanian, neither Western Aryan languages. What are the relationships between those groups? The group of the Middle World is near East. There is a huge distance between Western and Eastern Aryan languages. And once again, the problem is here. You see, for Lemansky, the relationship of those two groups is extremely problematic. So this was the situation at the end of the 19th century, where there was a really deep identity problem in Russia. And Jakobson belonged to this kind of questioning about identity and about the border between us and them. Now, what was Jakobson and his friends' answer to this question? I shall call of a group of people who were called the Eurasianists in the 1930s. They were Russian emigrants after the Bolshevik Revolution who lived mostly in Prague, Paris, and Belgrade. They were Trubetskoy, Savitsky, and Jakobson. Once again, Jakobson, here Trubetskoy. Here you have an interesting picture. This is Trubetskoy, and this is Piotr Savitsky. Savitsky was a geographer. And what is important for our discussion is that Savitsky called himself a structuralist geographer. So we have to understand, to figure out what exactly does the word structuralism mean for a geographer, for a Eurasianist geographer like Savitsky. For all those Russian intellectual emigres in Central and Western Europe in the 1920s and 30s, something was quite clear. There is West and East. West is Europe, and East is Eurasia. In Europe, you have the Romano-Germanic languages. In Eurasia, the Turanian languages. Turanian languages are languages like Turk or Finnish. Not Finnish, but Finno-Ugric languages. And now, look, you see, we all know, and of course, Jakobson and Trubetskoy knew that all Slavic languages have a common ancestor, which is the proto-common Slavic language. Of course, they knew it perfectly well. But for them, having a common ancestor is not as important as having neighbors with whom you are in a symbiotic relationship. So, for all those people, for Jakobson and Trubetskoy, you see, Russian was, of course, sort of a Slavic language, but not only a Slavic language, because it had features which are in symbiosis with the Turkic languages of the Soviet Union. So you see that little by little, we are beginning to quit the model of the common ancestor to understand that there are features which are common to different groups of phenomena, here languages, but it could be some other phenomena, and those common features do not mean that the Turkic and Slavic languages have a common ancestor, but only that they look like each other. And we'll have to understand what it means to be like each other without having a common ancestor. So now I'll draw your attention to this map. You see, in the history of the representations of identity, here we have the Slavophile border. This is Hilferding and Lamansky. You see that for the Slavophile border, the difference between us and them includes Finland, the Baltic states, all Central Europe where German is not spoken, includes all the Balkans and Romania, whereas the Eurasian border excludes all this part of Europe, and if you draw a line from Murmansk, Brest, Galați, then you will have this new border. So little by little, the border of identity goes east. And I think that this passage toward the east has something to do with representations of science and with explanation of what similarity means. So look how Jakobson thinks about the languages in Eurasia, which means Soviet Union without the Baltic states. So for Jakobson, you see, all that is the Soviet Union. But on the northwest, there is a Baltic Union of languages, where in Lithuanian, Swedish, for instance, you have a phonological opposition of tonality. I hope you know more or less what is phonology. We'll speak about it tomorrow, but there is a tone differentiation in Lithuanian and Swedish, and it is exactly, he says that it is the same characteristics you have in Chinese and Vietnamese. And in Eurasia, there is another opposition, another phonological opposition between hard and soft consonants. In Russian, for instance, you can have an opposition between tok, tyok, t, t. And this opposition has a result in the meaning of the words. So it is phonological. So the hard, soft opposition is a systemic internal feature. But Jakobson thinks that physically it belongs to the same phonological systemic feature, belongs to languages which are not linked genetically, which do not have the same common ancestor. So you see, the result is that we have a typically geometrical vision of the relationships between languages. And what is interesting is that Jakobson says, look, on both sides of this territory, symmetrically, we have the same union of languages. And he says, this is not by chance. Это не случайно. And это не случайно, this is not by chance, is typically the kind of reasoning that all those people have, because if you can prove that there is symmetry and an axis of symmetry, then it is the proof that your reasoning is right. We'll go back a little later to the problem of geometry and symmetry. But here, please remember that geometry is more important than geography. I think this is an ideal of order and harmony that all those people were fed with Hegel and Plato, and that they all were looking for an harmonious order of all the events on the cultural and natural events. And a keyword here will be a zone. What is a zone and what is a natural zone as far as cultures or geographical facts or languages are concerned? So look, this is Eurasia. Eurasia is perfectly rectangular. And Eurasia, for the geographer Savitsky, is divided into natural zones of vegetation. In the center, from north to south, you have tundra, and then forest, and then steppe, and then desert. And the more you get towards periphery, the less zones you have. You see, here you have only tundra, forest, steppe. Here you have only tundra, forest, and desert. And finally, in the periphery, here you have only two zones, tundra, forest, and tundra and forest. More than that, here in the center, you have the greatest concentration of zones. So we have now two axes of symmetry, because from north to south, temperature gets higher, and from south to north, humidity gets higher. So you see why I think that those people were deeply involved in Platonism, because for them, what is hidden is more real than what is visible. For all the Platonists, the invisible is more real than the visible. So, of course, if you look at a map, you will not get this perfect layout. But if you are able to see behind the surface, then you will get only order and harmony. And the center will be precisely in the middle. It's not a joke, because it is not obvious that the center will be in the middle. See, for instance, Moscow is the administrative center, but it's not at all in the middle. But here, for Savitsky, the center is in the middle. And the small number of zones in the periphery is perfectly normal, because it is the periphery. So, interpreting a landscape is a sort of hermeneutic. I'll show you an example of this kind of scientific ideology. If you draw a line from Pskov to Novocherkassk in Russia, you get an isogloss. An isogloss is a line which divides two pronunciations of the same phoneme. Here you say, for instance, Naga. Here you say Naha. Everybody knows that. It is perfectly clear, and first-year students of Russian learn that. Fine, no problem. But what becomes interesting is when Savitsky explains that this is a line which divides two zones where all the features overlap. Look, for instance, where they say Naga, they breed more sheep than pigs, whereas where they say Naha, they breed more pigs than sheep. Or let's take the date when the rivers melt in spring. You see, on this side of the border, the rivers, I quote Savitsky, it's not my words, I quote Savitsky, please. So Savitsky says that, and perhaps it's true after all, that the rivers melt after April the 15th, and here, well, more on the southwest, the rivers melt before April the 15th. So you see, once again, we get an extremely harmonious picture of the territory. A zone is a whole set of features which coexist and which are in harmony with one another. Another thing which is important for the linguists is that you don't ask the opinion of the speakers of the languages. You see, the languages are supposed to be natural objects which exist on a specific territory, as if speakers were plants or animals who adhere to a territory. But this is another problem. And what does Savitsky say? He says, "Это не случайно." It is not by chance. So please remember that for all those people, there is no chance at all. Chance does not exist and cannot exist, because what is hidden is more real than what you see, and what is hidden is order and harmony. what exists cannot not exist. This is typically Hegelian. Now, let's go back to the languages. We all learned at school or in the university that there is a common ancestor and that by divergence the languages split, and little by little the languages which are spoken now, if they look like each other, it is because they have a common ancestor, the Ursprache, the proto-language. Well, and this is more or less true for the Slavic languages, for the German languages, for the Roman languages. Of course, you see Italian and French are here, and here you have Latin, and here you have something like Proto-Indo-European. But there are facts which do not fit inside this layout. There are languages about which we know that they do not have any common ancestor, but which nonetheless look like each other. For instance, in the middle of the 19th century, people like Hübschmann began to learn Armenian. And Armenian is interesting because it has some features which are extremely similar to Georgian, but Armenian and Georgian have no common ancestor. So the problem is how to explain that phenomena which look like each other without a common ancestor. So one possibility of explaining this mystery is convergence. It is the idea that some phenomenon, for instance languages or cultures or anything you want, may, during evolution, they may acquire similarities, which they did not have in the beginning. And this is a naturalist metaphor of what a convergence here. You see here you have two glaciers which begin to merge together, but they have different origins. So here is just an example of the discussions which are extremely common now in Eastern Europe about the evolution of languages. A typical question, without any possible answer, is Ukrainian and Great Russian the same language or different languages? So please understand that from the linguistic point of view, this is a totally absurd question. But from an ideological and political point of view, it's very important. So the official Soviet theory, with people like Filin, for instance, says there was a common Slavic, and the offspring of common Slavic is Old Russian, and the offspring of Old Russian was Belarusian, Great Russian, and Ukrainian. This was the official theory until the end of the Soviet Union. But very soon, there was another theory, even at the very end of the Soviet Union, which says that Ukrainian is not linked with Old Russian, but with Old Ukrainian, which in its turn is directly linked to common Slavic. So, for instance, there are a very well-known grammar by Zizany, for instance, grammar of Old Russian, which have been written in Vilno, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the end of the 16th century. And there is one version which has been printed in Moscow which explains that the grammar, it was the grammar of Old Russian, but the same grammar has been printed in Minsk where it is supposed to be a grammar of Old Belarusian. And of course, there is a version in Kiev which is supposed to be the Old Ukrainian. You see, I like those questions because they have absolutely nothing to do with linguistics, but are extremely important in the way that classification is thought about.
Sorry, can I interrupt?
Sorry?
Zizany's grammar has nothing to do with Old Russian. It's Czechoslovak.
Yes. But this is an interesting problem because the Remnyova in Moscow University says that it is, first of all, it is not a Czechoslovak. It is a local, more or less invented version of something which was more or less. There is not even a name for that. You see that. Yes, but what is interesting is that there are three different ways of reprinting this grammar. And now, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there are people, not all, but who think that, you see, Ukrainian has only one ancestor, which is all Ukrainian, that Belarusian has only one ancestor, etc. So there is absolutely nothing in common between those three languages. Now, personally, I think that the situation is infinitely more complicated, and that a rather good metaphor is the resemble. But this is not so important. I have to run a little bit, because I want to go back to our Eurasianists. So, in 1936, Trubetskoy wrote a paper, Gedanken über das Indo-Germanen Problem, where we have a total reversal of the genealogical model. For Trubetskoy, there was nothing like a common ancestor. There was nothing like a Proto-Indo-European language. And in the beginning, there were different sorts of languages, which little by little came to resemble each other without having a common ancestor. Now, I have to explain what is at stake in this discussion about recognizing or not recognizing a common ancestor. And you will immediately see how linguistics and biology are linked together. What was the situation in 1861? The general model was the family tree. So, for Schleicher, this is typically the way that, you see, I was talking about, there was an Indo-Germanic proto-languages, which little by little divided, and here we have the offsprings. And this is, this is Haeckel's tree. You see that the linguists and the biologists at that time thought of evolution exactly in the same way. And it is even difficult to say who influenced whom, because there was a common way of thought, which means that similarity between two phenomena can be explained only because there is a common ancestor. Now, who are they? They are the felines, yes. And it is obvious that those three sorts of animals, they do not belong to the same species, but nonetheless, they have something in common. They are sort of a family. They all have long moustache, and they have the same way of walking. So they cannot have babies together, but nonetheless, they more or less look like each other.
So it's not tiger, it's leopard.
Okay, no, thank you. It is not important for what we're speaking about. So, there are three species, but one order. And the problem is, if you are realistic or nominalist, you can say that they look like each other because they have a common ancestor, or that the idea of the felines is only an ideal, intellectual, abstract type of classification. And this question, which is quite important, and I have absolutely no answer in biology, but in linguistics, it is exactly the same question. Now, if I rightly understood the problem in the 19th century, the biological metaphor was possible in linguistics because the implicit model was natural sciences. So if at that time biological species were defined by interfecundity, then so languages were defined by inter-understanding. It was so simple, so clear, so obvious, so evident. But of course it is not evident at all. Well, those are many examples of family trees, but let's go on. What is interesting in the huge crisis of the modals at the end of the 19th century, it was the crisis of positivism, the crisis of purely explaining similarities through the common ancestor. Because there are facts which do not fit in the model. So we already spoke about Armenian, you see. There are contexts Georgian and Armenian are in contact with each other, and the first way of explanation was that they had borrowing between each other. But borrowing does not explain all the huge amount of purely grammatical similarity, and there are other borders and languages which do not have anything in common. So pure contact is not able to explain everything. One important person for our discussion is one of the first types of rebuttal of the family tree model. It is Hugo Schuchart. Schuchart thought that all languages are mixed, and that there is no language which is not mixed. Es gibt keine ungemischte Sprache. So let's go on. So this was the discovery of hybridization in linguistics. Another important person for our discussion is Nicolas Marr. Nicolas Marr, unfortunately, he's supposed to be a lunatic, but let's admit that he was a lunatic, but nonetheless, he has extremely important and interesting and original ideas about languages. Because for him, you see, he also had a tree, but this tree was not a genealogical tree. It was a typological tree where different types of languages succeed one another. Okay, so this is the typological tree in 1929 for Marr. And you see, all that is absolutely fascinating, but we have no time to go on like that. Another important person is Johannes Schmidt for his wave theory model, the Wellentheorie, where he had a perfect diffusionist model and totally anti-evolutionist. For him, any point can be a center, so of course any point can be a periphery. So his idea of relationships between languages is only that somewhere you have a new phenomenon which little by little spreads around, and there is no point where you will get exactly the same languages. This is extreme diffusionism and extreme nominalism. And this was a perfect rebuttal of the family tree model. So let's go on. I wanted to show you some examples of this theory. And let's go back to the problem of convergence. Where does all that come from? So the relationships between biology and linguistics, I think, should be important in the history of semiotics. And here we come to our hero, who is Lev Berg, with an explicitly anti-Darwinian model in evolutionary biology. His book in 1922, Nomogenesis, was almost immediately translated in English in 1926. The core of his theory is that evolution relies on law. So for him also, there is no chance. Everything relies only on law, which is nomos in Greek, and you get nomogenesis, evolution by law. So law means no chance. This is the formula you have to remember. So these are whales, and you know that until the beginning of the 19th century, people thought that whales were fish, but afterwards they understood that whales are not fish but mammals. And the problem is that nonetheless, whales, which are not fish, but they look like fish. Why do whales look like fish? Well, some answer that is just by chance, but Berg explains that whales look like fish because they live in the same physical environment. But this is only a small part of the theory, because you could imagine that fish and whales have acquired common features just by living together in the water, which would be only a mechanical explanation. But Berg says, no, it is not a mechanical explanation. there is a common tendency from the very beginning. There was an evolutionary tendency from the beginning. Let's say, for instance, you see, this is a blind fish. Blind fish live in caves. Common sense say they are blind because they live in caves. It looks so obvious. But Berg says, no, 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 it's not like that. They live in caves because they are blind. So you see, once again, we have a total reversal of the model. So Berg says that they choose to live in caves because this environment fits better the fact that they are blind. Now, how did they choose? I don't know and I don't understand, but no problem. So what is important is that there was an orderly process. So look, Berg uses all lines of evidence, including the fossil record, to establish the claim that evolution had been an orderly process. He was totally opposed to the view that chance played a role in variation and was determined to show that all aspects of evolution were governed by law. External causes were not relevant. Witness the fact that the great ice ages had little overall effect on the direction of evolution. Instead, it was internal forces that were constantly driving variation along rigidly determined lines. Berg even insisted that many separate lines of evolution had advanced in parallel through the same sequence of vertebrate classes leading up to the mammals. So you see, all are keywords, and especially parallel evolution oriented toward the same goal. And this is teleology. So the basic course of evolution consisted of the unfolding of pre-existing rudimentary structures under the influence of internal forces. Internal forces. These forces were inherent in the chemical structure of living matter. But, to suppose that protoplasm was created with all these potentialities inherent within was necessary to invoke a purpose imposed on nature from without. I am quoting Dobzhansky's introduction to the English translation. So you see, now all the discussion was about not only about chance or not chance, but internal predetermined forces or external forces. So once again, the problem is how to explain that the similarity between phenomena which look like together. So you get predeterminism plus theology means nomogenesis. You may not forget Hegel, because this heavily relies on the idea of Hegel that everything which is may not be. Now, Berg is an interesting person to read, no problem. He was an ichthyologist, a specialist of fish, and a geographer and a philosopher of science. He was a member of the so-called Russian Renaissance in the beginning of the 20th century. And what is important for me is that he has a reputation of being structuralist, exactly as Savitsky has a reputation of being a structuralist geographer. And I think this is not the point if we agree, for our first definition, that structuralism is the idea that relationships are more important than the elements in the relationships. For Berg and Savitsky, structuralism means that everything is linked with everything. It is a huge theory of linking. And I think that link and structure are totally different things, because link are on the level of ontology and structure is in the level of epistemology. And if we mix, if we take ontology for epistemology, then the result will be a huge mess. This is the thesis I want to back up today. So you see, for Berg, exactly as for Savitsky, the systematic approach to nature means that everything is linked with everything. Exactly like Dokuchayev, who was a specialist in soil geology, introduces the concept of zone in pedology, which is the science of soil. For Dokuchayev, the evolution of the soil is linked or interacts, which is important, interacts with the climate, with the living and non-living elements, especially man's activity, which is totally interesting, perfectly common sense, but the key word here is linked and not structure. For Berg, geography is a science which deals with the laws of organization of the Earth's surface. A zone or natural landscape, Landschaft, is a set of features whose mutual influence and interactions provide a relative stability. a geographical zone or Landschaft is a dynamic set of interaction between living and non-living elements which are oriented towards an aim. This is finality. Example, tundra, taiga, steppe, desert are geographical natural zone, and a geographical zone is made of similar landscape. Now, of course, here we get the problem. How to define this similarity? Berg was a critic of Darwinism. For him, natural selection by chance cannot create anything new. He has a philosophy of purposive evolution of the living world. But what is a law? Now, I must draw your attention to a problem of terminology. In Russian, as in German, there are two different words. You see, it is extremely easy to translate from German to Russian and from Russian to German because the Russian philosophical terminology is borrowed from German. But it is extremely difficult to translate that into English or French. Gesetz is a law which can be a juridical law, but Gesetzmäßigkeit is something like an internal law, a natural law, something which exists by itself. Gesetz can be artificial, but Gesetzmäßigkeit is only natural, exactly like the difference between Zakon and Zakonomierność. Okay, so Berg is interested in Zakonomierność, not in Zakon. For Berg, the aim is to find and explain similarities which are not due to a common ancestor. And this is the part of Berg's theory which was taken by Jakobson to explain what the Russian language is and what the Eurasian Union of Languages is. So, okay, I have to go a little quicker now. So the main, what is at stake today is the question, why do things which look like each other, right? So who are those people? They are the bourgeois. And what is really interesting is that, let's say in the Stalin period, the main enemy was the буржуазная наука, the bourgeois science. Now, what do those bourgeois have in common with the idea of a science? What is a bourgeois science? Bourgeois science is an idealistic science. Now, excuse me, I have to ask you a question. What does idealism mean for you? Do you have a definition of idealism?
Do you mean the German philosophy?
The what?
Do you mean the German philosophy idea of idealism?
No, I mean how the Soviet ideology invented the concept of bourgeois science as being idealist.
Maybe idealistic as opposed to realistic?
Sure.
And idealistic as, in this sense, just as inventing something which has nothing to do with reality, or not?
Yes, and that's one explanation, perfectly right. And in this sense, it is a synonym of metaphysics. Metaphysics, idealism, all that are things which does not exist in reality. That's perfectly right, and that's more or less what it was in the Soviet times. But now, if you take the other side, the definition of idealism is, for the idealists, that what the idea is more real than materials. For instance, what is that? A triangle, okay? But in fact, it's not at all a triangle. Imagine that I have a piece of chalk. It would be chalk dust, only, from the only material point of view. Now, the idealist will say, you see, I can wipe it. But the idea of a triangle, you cannot destroy. You can use everything you want. You can use a Kalashnikov. You can use an atomic bomb. You cannot destroy the idea of a triangle. Therefore, the idea is more real than what I can do. You see, this is, even if I had a line anyway, it would be just the realization of something ideal. So I think this is important, also an important discussion about what reality is, because there are people who think that an idea is more real than matter. Okay, now you have to know that Berg's nomogenesis was described as being idealist in the first edition of the big Soviet encyclopedia in the end of the 1930s. But nonetheless, Berg was the director of the Institute of Geography of the Academy of Science between 1940 and 1950. So all the time, in the middle of the Stalin period, he was at a very high position in the Academy of Science, despite the fact that his theory was described as being idealist in the big Soviet encyclopedia. So there are three ways of explaining similarities of objects. Either the common ancestor, which was the dominant theory in positivism at the end of the 19th century, or the teleological convergence, which was Berg's and Jakobson explanation, and harmony and transcendence, which was extremely linked, not necessarily, but generally linked with this one for the Eurasians. Now, Obama has a double. And of course, by definition, doubles look like each other, and they have no common origin. And look, the French linguist Meillet says, this classifying according to general typological feature is bereft of any practical or scientific usefulness. It is a pastime which no linguist could capitalize. It means that for Meillet, the similarity between languages has no use at all. It is just a pastime. It is a game, but it has no meaning because for him, he was interested only in similarities which can be explained through the common ancestor. But on the other side, there are people who think that no similarity of form can be expelled because any similarity of form necessarily means a similarity of content. So, of course, I know perhaps there are people who think that they have something in common just because they look like each other. Or Meillet would say that it is just rubbish. It has no meaning at all. Now, in October, when I was here, we already spoke about Lyubyshev. Lyubyshev thought that if the shape of leaves of vegetables look like frost, it is not by chance, and that there must be an explanation for this similarity of forms. Another typical example is that you take, for instance, you see a sea snail, and in the sky, this is the micro level and macro level. So the similarity of form means that there must be something in common, and something in common might be common content. So I think we are going to yes, this is the last slide. So what was at stake today is that the great postulate that any similarity of form is meaningful. I have no answer for that, I don't know, but I think it is a postulate. A postulate is something which is not proved, but which remains at the level of postulate. It may have extremely interesting and positive consequences, but it is a postulate and not a proof. So now, yes. Okay, thank you.
And we can start the discussion. Okay. See, one important point of view was that these two types of structuralism, called structuralism, when in early Jakobson times, when actually he introduced the very term structuralism,
yes.
And now the more contemporary understanding, we shouldn't mix them up. They are so different. One is speaking about epistemological structure, other is ontological links.
Yes.
Now, I would like to argue that, say, it's at least more complex. Say that this is not by chance that the same term is used later about as if a different thing. Say, and simply, we indeed can define it differently, but these both include sort of core, which is the same. And here, this is now whether these structural relations, which we take at first or define as epistemological can also be sort of ontological at the same time as real, when they are not defined by us, but they are defined, say, somebody who also can make, can do epistemology. And on the other hand, these, or actually, then links can be links if they are living, or actually made by semiosis, they might be epistemological.
Yeah. I see the point, and I think this is an important question. We'll discuss about it tomorrow. Nonetheless, I would like to draw your attention that as long as you are on the epistemological level, you don't run the risk of arguing about, let's say, having a discourse of truth. The discourse of truth will have the result of the endless discussion about the Ukrainian language. Is it a part of Russian or is it a different language? There is no answer to that. But you have, of course, you can have different models. But the result, anyway, will be purely political. What I did not have time to discuss is that perhaps for Lev Berg, the core of the question was purely biological. But for Jakobson, it was not. For Jakobson, who belonged to a group of Russian emigres in Czechoslovakia, the problem was that the Soviet Union, which now was called Eurasia, should not be dismembered, that different parts of the whole total zone of Eurasia should not be cut into parts. And the problem was purely political at that time. So you see, what I mean is that if you begin to mix those two levels, ontological and epistemological, then the risk is great to have real problems. The second point is that I think the relationship between structuralism and the origin inside, let's say, German Romanticism and inside discussions on biology should also be taken into account, because it is interesting, it is important, and unfortunately, when I was a student in the university, you see, the general idea was that structuralism was invented somewhere in Paris in the beginning of the 1950s, which is total ignoring of the idea, the history of ideas in Germany and in Russia. And my job as a Slavist is to say, look, the intellectual relationships between Russia and the so-called Western Europe is more interesting than just reading literature and poetry and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Jakobson should also be studied as a Ruski philolog. And in that sense, we learn a lot. That's why we have to work together between biologists and linguists, between people in the so-called West and the so-called East, with many brackets, because ignoring the history of ideas prevents you to understand the contemporary state of science. That's all I wanted to say. But I perfectly understand that between epistemological and ontological levels, you can rely on what you call semiosis, for instance, which perhaps can be some belong to both sides. Yes.
Mm-hmm.